Most people think it started in the 90s or perhaps even the 60s. No. Its origins go back to World War I. Now, prior to the Great War, Karl Marx predicted that the workers of the world, united by class consciousness, would arise as one and overthrow national identities and bring about the paradise on earth of world communism. They considered this not theory, but science, accepted fact, and war would be the trigger. War came. The biggest, most appalling, most horrific war imaginable came. But communist revolution only came to agrarian, backwards Russia, which was practically a feudal country, and not to the modern, capitalist, industrialized nations like England and Germany and the United States, as communist science had assured the world that it would. Now, as the dust settled on the Great War, a group of Marxist philosophers decided to form an institute, a think tank, to analyze what had gone wrong. It was originally to be called the Institute for Marxism and would be similar to the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. But some worried that the Institute for Marxism might be a little bit too, actually a little bit too honest. So they decided instead to name it the Institute for Social Research. Based at Frankfurt University in Germany, the Institute for Social Research opened its doors on July 22, 1924, and over a short period of time, this Marxist brain trust became known simply as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School's problem was very simple. The workers, seduced by the material successes and general prosperity provided by capitalism, were too blinded, that's the word they often used, blinded, by this prosperity and relative well-being to recognize their class consciousness and bring about the communist revolution. Someone else would have to be the vanguard. But who? Now, while these Marxist intellectuals are trying to figure out who the new vanguard of the revolution was going to be, another problem arose. Nazism was on the rise in Germany. Many of these intellectuals were Jewish communists, doubly unwelcome in Hitler's Third Reich. So in 1934, they moved the Institute for Social Research out of Frankfurt and took refuge in America, specifically at Columbia University in New York City. The Institute for Social Research remained at Columbia until 1951, when it returned to Europe. Presumably, it wasn't very far from the Columbia School of Journalism, which awards the Pulitzer Prize. But it was while it was here in America that the Institute, still informally known as the Frankfurt School, did its most important work. The great insight gained by the Frankfurt School was to divorce Marxism from economics and marry Marxism to the culture. And the fruit of this fundamental change in strategy is known as critical theory. Now, the theory of critical theory is simply to criticize. I know it sounds silly when you put it so plainly, but really, that's all there is to it. You see, the Frankfurt School found their new vanguard for the revolution against Western civilization, and it was going to be the dispossessed. The beauty, the genius of critical theory was twofold. First, each area of critical theory could appear to be unique and self-contained. For example, feminism could attack Western culture from the perspective of its oppression against women, and that oppression must be unique to Western culture. No mention was made of what the ancient Chinese or the Aztecs or the Persians or anyone else, how they had treated women. Only the oppression of women in the West was on the table. Likewise, African American studies would only criticize American slavery, as if slavery were unique to America. The genuine horrors of American slavery and its consequences was a powerful weapon against traditional culture, as was the example of Rodney King. But to quote the black African King Gezo, who said in the 1840s, quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of all their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." You see, now a quote like that shows the economic incentive of a black culture to sell other blacks into slavery purely for economic gain. Quotes like that make slavery seem less about racism and more about economics, and quotes like that show that there's a little more than white English-speaking guilt to go around. It runs contrary to the narrative, and it has to be suppressed in schools. It is politically incorrect. Preeminent psychologist and Frankfurt School co-founder Erich Fromm argued that there were no real sexual differences between men and women, and that the roles they played in traditional Western culture were simply that, roles assigned to them by the culture. So now gender studies could launch critical theory attacks and claim that all of the oppression of homosexuals or women throughout history were due merely to Western culture and the corrupt patriarchy of dead white men. Dead white men laid the philosophical foundation for the United States of America. If capitalism had triumphed where Marxism had failed, the only way left to bring down this edifice of success and prosperity was to go to the root morality that it was based upon and attack it from all sides. Gender studies, radical feminism, African studies, Native American studies, the deconstruction of classical literature to show racism or sexism or whatever other useful ism for philosophies that didn't even exist at the time of their writing. All of these programs, and all they do, is inculcate and aggravate a sense of rage, separatism, and victimology, and assign to the only culture that actually tries to eradicate these injustices the sole onus of their origins. Now, I said that critical theory was brilliant strategy in two ways. The first being that it launched multiple, apparently unconnected attacks against the dominant culture. But the real source of its power and genius, however, is that the criticism never demands an alternative. What might have been better, what might have worked in its place, what alternatives have been tried successfully in the past, nothing. That's because they have nothing. There is no logic, no history, and no factual underpinning to their dreams and philosophy. Everything they believe in has proven to be wrong. It's been drowned in oceans of blood and tears.